Have you ever considered how a nomadic tribe, a tiny speck on the map, could possibly grow into one of the most powerful and enduring empires the world has ever seen? An empire that spanned 3 continents and survived for over 6 centuries. It's a strange and baffling story, full of twists of fate and unlikely heroes, like a real-life historical fantasy where the side characters suddenly take over the entire stage. How does a small group, led by a man named Osman, transform itself from a mere border principality into a civilization that would one day lay siege to Vienna and reshape the political map of the Mediterranean? And what about the mystery of their name? Was it a simple anglicization? Or did they themselves embrace the term Ottoman from their founder, a linguistic link across the centuries? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fun to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. Once upon a time, on the fringes of the Byzantine Empire, a quiet figure named Osman emerged from the chaotic landscape of Anatolia. His story, like many founding myths, is shrouded in a mist of legend and sparse historical record, making it tricky to pin down every detail. But the general gist is clear. He was the son of Ertugrul, a tribal leader of the Kayu clan, a group of Oghuz Turks who had migrated west to escape the relentless pressure of the Mongol invasions. These were not sedentary city dwellers, but a tough, mobile people living a life of constant movement with their herds and their tents. Ertugrul had been granted a small plot of land by the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, a buffer zone near the Byzantine border, in exchange for his service as a Ghazi, a warrior for Islam. It was a humble beginning, to be sure, a small landholding on the frontier, a tiny piece of the ever-shifting jigsaw puzzle that was medieval Anatolia. When Osman succeeded his father around 1281, he inherited not a kingdom, but a strategic little patch of land on the edge of two collapsing worlds, the fading Seljuk Sultanate and the crumbling Byzantine Empire. Imagine the scene. A young leader in his early 20s, surrounded by rival Turkic clans and the lingering power of the Byzantines, with a clear choice before him. He could hunker down and try to survive, or he could expand. Osman, a shrewd and pragmatic leader, chose the latter. He didn't just wage war for land. He played a masterful political game, forming alliances with local leaders, both Muslim and Christian, and attracting a steady stream of followers, a mix of restless tribesmen, Sufi mystics, and disenfranchised farmers seeking stability. The key to his early success was his ability to offer something more than just plunder. He offered a sense of purpose and a shared identity. His followers were not just a ragtag bunch of warriors. They were the Ottomans, a new force for a new age. The early Ottoman conquests were not dramatic, sweeping campaigns, but a slow, methodical process of chipping away at Byzantine territory. Osman's forces, known as the Ghazis, specialized in lightning raids and skirmishes, targeting isolated Byzantine strongholds and rural areas. This was a classic case of death by 1,000 cuts, while the great powers of the world were preoccupied with other conflicts: the Mongols, the Crusades, the Hundred Years' War. Osman was quietly building his power base, one village and one fort at a time. The Byzantine emperors, distracted by internal struggles and threats from other fronts, were largely unable to mount a coordinated and effective response. They saw this small Turkish principality as a nuisance, a fly buzzing around the fringes of their once great empire, not as the existential threat it would soon become. And to be fair, who would have? The odds seemed utterly ridiculous. Osman's most significant early victory, the Battle of Bapheus in 1302, was not a massive pitched battle, but a relatively small engagement that held outsized symbolic importance. It was the first time the nascent Ottoman state faced and defeated a professional Byzantine army, a clear signal that this was no ordinary band of raiders. This victory solidified his reputation and drew even more followers to his banner, transforming his tiny realm from a mere borderland principality into a recognizable political entity. It was the moment when the world, or at least that part of the world, began to sit up and take notice. After this, the raids intensified and the ambitions grew bolder. The Ottomans started to lay siege to the major Byzantine cities in Anatolia, including the crucial city of Bursa. Historians still argue whether Osman himself lived long enough to see the final capture of Bursa, but its conquest would mark a watershed moment. It would become the first major capital of the Ottoman state, a physical representation of their transformation from a nomadic tribe into a settled urban power. The simple truth is, he laid the groundwork for everything that came after, building a structure on the bones of a collapsing world. It was a beginning that was anything but grand, yet it contained all the seeds of a future empire. And with that, Osman, the first of his name, faded into history. But the movement he started was just getting its legs. So, Osman, he's gone. But his nascent state, now anchored by the conquest of Bursa, has a new leader in his son, Orhan. This is where things get really interesting, where the myth-making starts to give way to the more solid, though still murky, historical record. With Bursa as his new capital, Orhan was no longer just a tribal chief. He was a proper emir, and his new domain, now referred to as the Ottoman Emirate, had a city and a population to govern. He took on the trappings of a ruler, minting his own coins and establishing the first permanent administrative institutions, a far cry from the days of raiding from tented camps. He was essentially building the operating system for what would become an empire. From the ground up, his reign was a masterclass in strategic expansion and institutional development. Orhan understood that military might alone wasn't enough. You needed a stable system to support it. He continued his father's policy of consolidating power in Anatolia, but his methods were more sophisticated. He didn't just conquer territories, he incorporated them, offering fair treatment to the local populations, including the Byzantines, who were often tired of the corruption and instability of their own rulers. This was a key part of the Ottoman recipe for success, a kind of carrot and stick approach, where the carrot was often more appealing than the stick. This isn't to say there weren't battles, of course. His forces captured Nicaea and Nicomedia, two historically significant Byzantine cities, and continued to push west, inching ever closer to the strait that separated Asia from Europe. But the most revolutionary development under Orhan's rule was military in nature, and it would become the very backbone of the empire for centuries to come. He's often credited with the creation of the Janissaries, the legendary elite infantry corps of the Ottoman military. Now, the exact origin story of the Janissaries is a bit like a historical ghost story, with historians still arguing whether they were officially formed under Orhan or his successor, Murad II. But regardless of the exact timing, the concept itself was a game changer. The idea was to take young Christian boys from newly conquered territories, convert them to Islam, and train them from a very young age to be loyal, professional soldiers, beholden only to the Sultan. This system, known as devshirme, was ethically complicated and, to our modern sensibilities, quite unsettling. Yet, at the time, it was a stroke of strategic genius. It provided the Sultan with a standing army that was fiercely loyal, highly disciplined, and completely independent of the powerful and often rebellious Turkish aristocratic families who commanded the traditional cavalry units. Imagine building a brand new army from scratch, without any of the political baggage of the old guard. It's like a corporate CEO building a new startup team on a different continent to bypass the old leadership. The result was a fighting force, unlike any other in Europe or the Middle East. This military innovation went hand in hand with the development of the Timar system, an economic and administrative structure that would sustain the empire's military machine. Basically, it was a form of land grant. Ottoman cavalrymen, called Sipahis, were given control over land and the right to collect taxes from it. In return, they were responsible for maintaining peace and order in their region and for showing up for military service with a certain number of armed men when called upon. It was a decentralized way of maintaining a large, ready army without a massive central bureaucracy. It's a bit like a medieval franchise model. You run your own little territory, but you're contractually obligated to provide military support to the head office, which is the Sultan. It was effective, but it also contained the seeds of future problems, as these Sipahis would later become a powerful and sometimes problematic landed class. Orhan also laid the foundations for a system of patronage that would define the empire's architecture and art. He commissioned mosques, bridges, and charitable complexes, or kulliyes, which often included schools, soup kitchens, and hospitals. This wasn't just about vanity projects. It was about building a functioning, stable society. It drew the best and brightest to his court and created a sense of permanence and order. It was during this period that the Ottomans started to develop a recognizable architectural style, blending elements from Seljuk and Byzantine traditions. He was building a legacy, literally and figuratively, with bricks and mortar. This period marked a crucial transition from a tribal confederacy to a true sultanate with a centralized bureaucracy, a professional army, and a clearly defined territory. He had inherited a small borderland and was preparing to hand off an emerging regional power. With the Anatolian territories largely consolidated and the nascent institutions humming along, Orhan, the first sultan of the Ottomans, was now faced with a tantalizing prospect. The Byzantine Empire, once a monolithic power, was a shell of its former self, torn apart by bitter civil wars and internal strife. It's like watching a huge corporation implode from the inside, and you're the hungry, agile startup waiting to pick up the pieces. The Ottomans, who had spent decades as a thorn in the side of Byzantium, were now poised to become something far more significant. The golden opportunity arrived not through a full frontal assault, but through a rather bizarre invitation. One of the Byzantine pretenders to the throne, a gentleman named John Cantacuzenos, desperate for military aid against his rival, Emperor John IV Palaiologos, did what desperate rulers often do and called in a big favor from the guy who lives next door with the big army. He asked Orhan for help, even giving his daughter Theodora in marriage to Orhan as a show of good faith. This move, a historical oopsie-daisy of epic proportions, gave the Ottomans their first legitimate reason to cross the Hellespont Strait, a move that would permanently change the course of European history. Their first official foray into Europe was as mercenaries for the Byzantines, a peculiar arrangement where they were technically helping to secure the very empire they would later dismantle. The Ottomans, under Orhan's son, Suleiman Pasha, didn't just fight, they started to get a feel for the land, a preview of what was to come. Then, in 1354, an event of immense historical significance occurred, one that historians still debate the precise meaning of. A massive earthquake struck the region, and it was so powerful that it crumbled the walls of the strategically vital Byzantine fortress of Gallipoli, a city that controlled access to the Dardanelles Strait. This wasn't just a lucky break. It was like a divine cosmic wink, a green light from the universe. The Ottomans, showing no hesitation or sentimentality for their Byzantine allies, seized the now undefended city. They didn't just take it, they immediately fortified it and started populating it with Muslim settlers from Anatolia, turning it into an impregnable bridgehead into Europe. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a permanent colonization, a physical declaration that they were here to stay. The capture of Gallipoli was an absolute game changer. It meant the Ottomans no longer had to rely on a rickety fleet to ferry troops back and forth across the strait. They had a solid, permanent base on European soil, a forward operating hub from which they could launch campaigns into the Balkans. From this point forward, the trajectory of the empire was no longer confined to Anatolia. It was set to expand westwards. While Orhan spent his final years overseeing this monumental shift, it was his successor, Murad III, who would truly capitalize on the opportunity. He inherited a state that was now a dual continent power, and he was the one who would march it decisively into the heart of the Balkans. He was a gifted military commander who wasted no time in his pursuit of conquest. He pushed north into Thrace, taking the city of Adrianople, modern-day Edirne, in 1362. This was a critical victory, not just for its strategic location, but for its symbolic weight. It was so important that Murad made it his new capital, moving the center of Ottoman power from Bursa in Asia to Adrianople in Europe. It was a clear statement of intent, and it sent shivers down the spine of every ruler in the region. Murad Khan's reign was a whirlwind of expansion, a continuous campaign of pushing the frontiers of his burgeoning empire. He systematically subdued the various Serbian, Bulgarian, and Byzantine warlords and princes who had carved out their own little fiefdoms in the wake of Byzantine decline. It was a messy business, with constant skirmishes and shifting alliances, but Murad was relentless. This is where we really see the effectiveness of the institutions Orhan had put in place. particularly the Janissaries and the Timar system. The professional, disciplined Janissary Corps was a force multiplier on the battlefield, and the Sipahis, the cavalrymen who managed the land grants, were the boots on the ground who secured the newly conquered territories. It was a well-oiled machine of conquest and consolidation, and it was working perfectly. The people of the Balkans, often living under the heavy-handed rule of their feudal lords, were sometimes surprisingly open to Ottoman rule, which often brought a degree of stability, and believe it or not, religious tolerance that was not always present in their own Christian states. This isn't to say it was all peaceful. It was absolutely not. But the Ottoman approach was often more pragmatic than purely dogmatic, and so the Ottoman state continued to grow, swallowing up territory and transforming itself from a regional power into a continental one. Murad I, a man of relentless energy and ambition, was always pushing forward. He'd conquered Thrace and parts of Macedonia, and by the 1380s, his gaze was fixed on Serbia. His campaigns were not just about land, they were about control of the trade routes and the rich agricultural lands of the Danube basin. The stage was being set for a final, climactic confrontation with the most powerful of the Balkan states, an encounter that would become one of the most famous battles of the medieval era. But for now, Murad was establishing the groundwork, pushing his new empire to its limits. His transformation of Adrianople into a grand capital, filled with mosques and administrative buildings, was a signal to the world that this was no longer a temporary incursion. The Ottomans had come to Europe to stay, and the old order was about to be put to the ultimate test. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another, and so the stage was set for the most famous clash of Murad I's reign. The various Balkan states, Serbia, Bosnia, Bulgaria, were finally beginning to see the writing on the wall. The Ottoman advance wasn't just a series of raids. It was an inexorable, territorial steamroller. And if they didn't unite, they would be swallowed one by one. This realization led to the formation of a formidable coalition, primarily under the command of Prince Lazar of Serbia, a powerful and charismatic leader who rallied a host of his fellow nobles and allies. This wasn't just a political or military conflict. It had the feel of a religious crusade, a desperate last stand to defend Christendom against the rising tide of Islam. Murad, for his part, was not just a conqueror, he was a builder. During the lull before the storm, he continued to construct mosques, schools, and hospitals in his new European capital of Adrianople, a testament to his confidence that this land was now, and would forever be, Ottoman. But there could be no doubt that the final showdown was coming. The fateful day arrived on June 15, 1389, on the plains of Kosovo-Polje, which means Field of Blackbirds. The two armies, the Ottoman forces led by Sultan Murad I and his sons, and the Balkan coalition commanded by Prince Lazar, met in a cataclysmic battle that would be immortalized in legend and folklore. To this day, the Battle of Kosovo remains a foundational myth for the Serbian people, a story of heroism and martyrdom. For the Ottomans, it was a pivotal victory that solidified their control over the Balkans. Historians still argue whether the numbers were as lopsided as the folklore suggests, but what's certain is that it was a fierce, brutal fight with immense casualties on both sides. The battle itself was a tactical masterpiece for the Ottomans. Murad's Janissaries formed the core of his infantry, a steadfast anchor, while his Sipahi cavalry maneuvered on the flanks. The Serbian forces fought bravely, but the superior organization and discipline of the Ottoman army proved decisive. But the story of Kosovo is most famous for its dramatic climax, a moment of profound shock and chaos that remains shrouded in mystery. In the middle of the fighting, a Serbian knight named Miloš Obilić, according to legend, feigned defection to the Ottoman side. When he was brought before Sultan Murad, he knelt as if to pay homage, and then, in one swift, shocking move, produced a concealed dagger and stabbed the Sultan, mortally wounding him. It was an act of incredible audacity, a kamikaze-style attack that succeeded in its primary goal. Murad, thus, the man who had overseen the Ottoman push into Europe, died on the battlefield. The news of his death was a disaster for the Ottomans. Imagine the scene. The Sultan is down, the fighting is still raging, and the entire chain of command is thrown into disarray. But as is often the case with well-structured organizations, the machine didn't fall apart. Murad's son, Bayezid, immediately took command, showing a ruthless pragmatism that would define his reign. His first act as the new sultan was to secure his position. He ordered the execution of his own brother, Yaqub Çelebi, a common practice known as fratricide, which ensured that there would be no civil war for the throne. He then went on to rally the troops and, with the full force of a newly united leadership, crushed the remaining Serbian resistance. Prince Lazar was captured, and as was the custom for fallen enemy leaders, was executed. The victory was complete, but it had come at an incredibly high price. It was a victory won, but not a victory enjoyed. The death of the Sultan on the field of battle gave the entire event a tragic, heroic cast that would linger for centuries. For the Ottomans, it was a brutal initiation for their new leader. For the Serbs, it was the start of a long period of vassalage, a cultural touchstone of national pride mixed with sorrow. Bayezid, now in charge, was a man of action. He earned the nickname Yildirim, or the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his military campaigns. He immediately set about consolidating the gains from Kosovo and imposing Ottoman authority throughout the Balkans. He annexed much of what remained of Bulgaria and established direct rule over a significant portion of Serbia. The vassal states that had fought against him at Kosovo were now either incorporated into the empire or forced to pay tribute and provide military support. The Byzantine Empire, now a pathetic remnant centered on Constantinople, was completely surrounded, a small island in a rapidly expanding Ottoman sea. Bayezid even started building fortresses on the Bosphorus, within sight of Constantinople's walls, a constant reminder of the city's precarious position. His ambition was clear: to finally take the ultimate prize. The stage was set for a new chapter of Ottoman history, one of lightning-fast conquests and the formalization of a sultanate that was no longer just a collection of tribes, but a powerful empire in its own right. The Battle of Kosovo was the final stamp on Murad's legacy and the fiery opening act of his sons. The empire was now not just a regional power, but a true force to be reckoned with. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, wasted no time in living up to his nickname. He had inherited the throne on the battlefield, and he ruled with that same ruthless speed and efficiency. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused on slow, methodical expansion, Bayezid was all about rapid, decisive conquest. He was a force of nature, a blur of military campaigns that seemed to happen all at once. He quickly brought the remaining independent Turkish beyliks in Anatolia under his direct control, often through diplomatic pressure and marriage alliances, but also with brute force when necessary. It was a clear signal to everyone. The Ottoman Empire was no longer just one of many Turkish states. It was the Turkish state, a singular power in the region. He wasn't just a sultan. He was an emperor in the making. He consolidated his gains, but his sights were still set on Europe. And he was determined to prove to the Christian world that the loss at Kosovo was just the beginning of their troubles. The Christian rulers of Europe, for their part, were finally starting to get the message. The sheer audacity of the Ottoman advance, the fall of major cities, and the humiliating defeat at Kosovo had finally shaken them out of their complacency. They could no longer pretend this was just a distant regional conflict. Pope Boniface XII called for a new crusade, and a massive army was assembled, primarily composed of French and Hungarian knights, led by a dashing young man named John the Fearless, the Count of Nevers. This was a proper, full-scale European coalition, a medieval Avengers team, if you will, but with less spandex and more clanking armor. Their goal was to lift the Ottoman siege of the Hungarian fortress of Nicopolis, which was a strategic choke point on the Danube River. The Crusaders were confident, almost arrogant in their belief that their superior cavalry and divine mission would easily sweep away the infidel Turks. They were so sure of themselves that they famously sent a message to Bayezid. If the sky were to fall on our heads, we would prop it up with our lances. A little hubris, one might say. A lot of hubris, actually. The two armies met near Nicopolis in September 1396. The battle was a complete and utter disaster for the Crusaders. Bayezid, who had a much clearer understanding of his enemy's tactics than they had of his, set a trap. He positioned his Janissary infantry, armed with bows and primitive firearms, on a hill behind a screen of Ottoman Akıncı raiders and light cavalry. The French knights, in their youthful enthusiasm and reckless courage, ignored the advice of their more seasoned Hungarian allies and charged forward with a furious, undisciplined abandon. They rode straight through the Ottoman vanguard, a moment of fleeting triumph that quickly turned into a trap. They were met by a volley of arrows, and then, as they tired from climbing the hill in their heavy armor, they were confronted by the fresh, disciplined ranks of the Janissaries. It was like a medieval mosh pit, but with swords. The battle turned into a rout. The French knights were annihilated, their leaders captured and held for ransom. The Hungarian army, seeing the destruction of their allies, was forced to retreat in disarray. The victory was a complete triumph for Bayezid. He had not only defeated a major European coalition, he had utterly humiliated them. The Battle of Nicopolis was a massive blow to the Christian world, and it cemented Bayezid's reputation as one of the most fearsome rulers of his time. It confirmed the Ottoman Empire's status as a major player in Europe and opened the way for further expansion into the Balkans. The Ottoman victory was so decisive that for a time, no one dared to challenge their power in the region. Bayezid, with his European flank secured, turned his attention back to his ultimate goal, the final conquest of Constantinople. He laid siege to the city multiple times, tightening the noose around the Byzantine capital. He even built the fortress of Anadolu Hizara on the Asian side of the Bosphorus to control the sea traffic, mirroring what his great-grandson would do on the European side nearly a century later. Constantinople was now a city on life support, a sad little island in a vast Ottoman sea. Bayezid was on the verge of claiming the prize that every Ottoman sultan had dreamed of, the magnificent city of Constantine himself. But just when it seemed like his triumph was inevitable, a new, unforeseen threat emerged from the east, a threat that would put the brakes on his rapid expansion and throw the entire Ottoman Empire into chaos. The Mongol conqueror, Timur, or Tamerlane, had been building a new empire in Central Asia, and his ambitions were about to collide with Bayezid's. Historians still argue whether Bayezid's arrogance in conquering the Anatolian Beyliks, which had been previously under Timur's sphere of influence, was the direct cause of the coming conflict. What is certain is that a storm was brewing, and Bayezid, in his quest for total power, was about to face a challenge he could never have anticipated. He had conquered Europe, but the world was about to come crashing down, just as Bayezid was tightening his grip on Europe and smelling victory at the gates of Constantinople. A far greater storm was brewing from the east. It's one of those classic history moments where one unstoppable force meets another, and you just know it's not going to end well for one of them. The unstoppable force in this case was Timur, or Tamerlane, a ruthless and brilliant Turco-Mongol conqueror who had carved out a vast and terrifying empire stretching from Central Asia all the way to Persia and Mesopotamia. He was a man who saw himself as the restorer of the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. And he had a reputation for leaving a wake of skulls and destruction wherever he went. The Ottoman Empire, which had been so successful in its rapid expansion, was about to run headfirst into a whirlwind. Bayezid, blinded by his own victories, made the fatal mistake of underestimating this new threat. He had a few run-ins with Timur's vassals in eastern Anatolia, and in his typical blustery fashion, he sent an arrogant letter to Timur, basically telling him to back off. Bad move. Very, very bad move. Timur, who was not a man to be trifled with, saw Bayezid's insolence as a direct challenge. He was a master of logistics and strategy, and he decided to teach the upstart Ottoman Sultan a lesson. He invaded Anatolia in 1402, and the two colossal armies met outside Ankara. The Battle of Ankara was a complete and utter disaster for the Ottomans, a defeat so profound that it shattered the empire to its very core. Bayezid had a powerful army, to be sure, but Timur's forces were larger, better organized, and had the crucial advantage of war elephants, which were a terrifying psychological weapon. But the real key to Timur's victory was a classic case of battlefield betrayal. Many of the Turkish troops in Bayezid's army were from the Anatolian Beyliks that he had recently annexed, and they held no loyalty to the Sultan who had conquered them. During the battle, large contingents of these troops defected to Timur's side, turning the tide of the fighting in an instant. The Janissaries fought bravely, but they were no match for the overwhelming force and a complete lack of support from the rest of the army. Bayezid was captured, Can you imagine? The thunderbolt of the Ottoman Empire, the man who had just humbled the entire Christian world, was now a prisoner of a Mongol warlord. The spectacle was one of the most shocking events of the early 15th century. Timur, with a dark sense of humor, reportedly paraded Bayezid around in a cage. Historians still argue whether this was a literal iron cage or a cage-like carrying device for the royal litter. But the image itself, of the proud sultan humbled, became a powerful symbol of Timur's dominance. The once mighty sultan eventually died in captivity, a broken man. His reign, which had promised so much, had ended in total humiliation. But the consequences of the Battle of Ankara were far more devastating than the death of a single ruler. Timur, after his victory, didn't stick around to rule. He had other things to do, other parts of the world to conquer. He simply left, but not before he had dismantled the Ottoman state. He restored the Anatolian beyliks that Bayezid had conquered to their former rulers, effectively turning back the clock on decades of Ottoman expansion. The empire was now leaderless and in complete disarray. What followed was a period of over a decade known as the Ottoman Interregnum, a chaotic and brutal civil war among Bayezid's four sons, Isa, Musa, Suleiman, and Mehmed. Each son, with their own power base and their own ambitions, fought for control of the fragmented empire. It was a messy, bloody, and unpredictable time. A real-life political drama with no clear heroes. The empire, which had seemed so invincible just a few years earlier, was now on the verge of total collapse. The European powers, seeing their chance, attempted to take back some of their lost territories. The Byzantines, for their part, were a mess, and the Ottomans were in no position to take advantage of it. It's a great example of how quickly a state can unravel when the central authority is removed. The lack of a clear line of succession, a problem the Ottomans had yet to solve, was proving to be a crippling weakness. But eventually, a clear winner emerged. The youngest of the brothers, Mehmed, was the most patient and strategic. He played a long game, first consolidating his power in Anatolia, and then slowly and methodically picking off his brothers one by one. It was a brutal struggle, but Mehmed, a man who would later earn the epithet Celebi, or the gentleman, showed that he had a steely determination beneath his more refined exterior. By 1413, he had finally defeated his last rival and reunited the empire, bringing an end to the brutal interregnum. The Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. It had lost much of its Anatolian territory, and its reputation for invincibility was gone. But it had survived. The fact that it survived at all, after such a cataclysmic defeat and a decade of civil war, is a testament to the strength of the foundations laid by Osman, Orhan, and Murad. The state was resilient, and it had found a new leader in Mehmed Fern, who was determined to restore its former glory. Mehmed Dasu, having finally emerged from the brutal and bloody chaos of the interregnum, was not a man to rush things. His reign was a period of consolidation and recovery, a chance for the empire to catch its breath after being pummeled by Timur, and then tearing itself apart in a civil war. He was a kind of anti-Bayezid, a leader who understood that sometimes the most important thing to do is to be quiet and rebuild. He focused on reasserting Ottoman authority over the Anatolian beyliks and bringing a sense of order back to the Balkans. He signed peace treaties with the Byzantines, Venice, and the Hungarians, and for a brief, glorious period, It seemed like the Ottoman Empire was going to be a well-behaved neighbor, but the foundations of the state were still shaky, and internal dissent, fanned by the previous years of conflict, was still a problem. His son, Murad II, inherited this fragile, recovering empire. But unlike his father, Murad was not content with quiet consolidation. He was a sultan who embodied the classical Ottoman paradox, a great military leader who was also a deeply religious and contemplative man, a warrior who longed for peace. His reign was dominated by a series of long, grueling wars against a powerful coalition of European states, primarily led by the Hungarians. The Hungarians, under the brilliant military commander János Hunyadi, were arguably the most formidable opponent the Ottomans had faced in Europe since the days of Bayezid. Hunyadi was a master of defensive warfare, a kind of medieval military genius who understood how to use his terrain and his troops to their best advantage. The two men, Murad and Hunyadi, would spend decades locked in a chess match of sieges and battles, a rivalry that would come to define the mid-15th century. Murad's early campaigns were a mixed bag. He laid siege to Constantinople again, but the city, in a stroke of historical stubbornness, refused to fall. He then turned his attention to the Balkans, but his advance was met with fierce resistance. In 1443, Hunyadi led a major offensive deep into Ottoman territory, a campaign known as the Varna Crusade. The Christian forces were so successful that Murad, a man who had been at war for most of his adult life, was utterly exhausted. He was also a man of deep faith, and he longed for a quiet life of piety and scholarship. In a stunning and almost unprecedented move, he decided to abdicate the throne in favor of his 12-year-old son, Mehmed. He then retired to Manisa in western Anatolia, seeking a life of spiritual contemplation. It was a move so bizarre and so unexpected that it sent shockwaves through the empire. His son, Mehmed, was now sultan. But imagine being a 12-year-old boy in charge of a massive, war-torn empire, surrounded by powerful, ambitious viziers and commanders. It was a recipe for chaos. The European powers, seeing the opportunity presented by a child sultan on the throne, immediately broke the peace treaty they had just signed with Murad. Pope Eugene IV, with the encouragement of Hunyadi, declared the treaty invalid because it was sworn on the name of a non-Christian god, a legalistic loophole that felt a bit like a medieval gotcha. Hunyadi once again led a massive army into Ottoman territory, determined to push the Ottomans back across the straits and deliver the final death blow. The Ottoman state, in the meantime, was on the verge of collapse. The Janissaries, never a patient bunch, were mutinous, and the viziers were fighting amongst themselves. The situation was desperate. The Grand Vizier, Sandalı Halil Pasha, had no choice but to appeal to the only man who could save them. He sent a message to the retired Sultan Murad, begging him to return. Murad was hesitant. He had left the world of politics and warfare and wanted nothing more to do with it. The Grand Vizier, in a moment of utter desperation, sent a second, more famous letter. He wrote to Murad, "If you are the Sultan, come and lead your armies. If I am the Sultan, I command you to come and lead your armies." That's a passive-aggressive burn for the ages. It was a plea so compelling that Murad could not refuse. He returned from retirement, a grizzled veteran stepping back into the fray, and once again took command of his forces. The stage was set for the climactic Battle of Varna in 1444. Hunyadi's Crusader army was well equipped and confident, but Murad's forces were filled with a grim determination. The battle was long and bloody, but in the end, the Ottoman army, led by its experienced Sultan, was victorious. The King of Poland and Hungary, Władysław III, was killed in the fighting, and the Crusader army was utterly destroyed. It was a complete and decisive victory. Murad had secured the Balkans once again, but the entire experience left a lasting impression on the young Mehmed, who had been a powerless witness to the chaos. He would remember this lesson well. Murad II, having saved his empire from the brink, once again retired to a quiet life. But this time, he was much more confident in his son. That son was Mehmed, and he had learned a powerful lesson from his brief, chaotic reign as a boy. A sultan could not be a puppet. He had seen firsthand how the viziers and the janissaries could run rampant without a strong hand at the helm. He had been a powerless figurehead, and he vowed never to be so again. When his father died in 1451, Mehmed returned to the throne, now a young man in his early 20s, but with a steely resolve that belied his age. He was a sultan with a plan, and that plan had only one goal: the conquest of Constantinople. From the very beginning of his second reign, Mehmed II, who would soon earn the epithet the Conqueror, made it his life's mission to take the city that had eluded his predecessors for so long. He understood that Constantinople was more than just a city. It was a symbol. It was the last vestige of the Roman Empire, the jewel of Christendom, and its continued existence was a constant challenge to Ottoman authority. Taking it would not only secure his empire, but would also give him a legitimacy that no other Muslim ruler had. He wasn't just a sultan anymore. He would be a new Caesar, the master of both Europe and Asia. He meticulously began his preparations, a long-term project that would require immense resources, cunning, and a terrifying level of strategic foresight. His first move was to build a formidable fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from the one his great-grandfather Bayezid had built on the Asian side. He called it Rumeli Hisari, the Fortress of Rumelia. It was a massive, incredibly fast construction project, a marvel of medieval engineering that was designed to control all sea traffic and cut off the city's last link to the Black Sea. The Byzantines, of course, protested, but they were in no position to stop him. The fortress was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare, a constant physical reminder that the noose was tightening. And while he built his fortress, he also began assembling the largest army and most advanced artillery the world had ever seen. He hired a Hungarian cannon maker named Urban, who had originally offered his services to the Byzantines, but was turned down due to lack of funds. Mehmed, on the other hand, paid him handsomely to build a cannon of truly colossal proportions, a superweapon for its time. On April 6, 1453, Mehmed and his massive army, estimated at over 80,000 soldiers, laid siege to Constantinople. The city, under the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine Sethitho Palaiologos, was a pathetic shell of its former glory. It had a mere 7,000 soldiers to defend its ancient but still formidable walls. The siege was long and brutal, a grinding war of attrition. The Byzantines, aided by a small number of Italian volunteers, fought with incredible courage and determination. The Ottoman cannons, including Urban's monster bombard, pounded the walls relentlessly, creating breaches that the defenders would desperately try to patch up at night. But despite the technological advantage, the Ottomans faced a daunting challenge. The city's famous Theodosian walls were still a near impenetrable masterpiece of defensive engineering. The Golden Horn, the city's harbor, was protected by a giant chain that prevented the Ottoman fleet from entering. The siege seemed to be going nowhere, but Mehmed was not a man to be deterred by a simple chain. In a move of incredible ingenuity that still boggles the mind, he ordered his engineers to build a kind of wooden railway over the hills behind the city. They greased the tracks and, over the course of a single night, dragged his fleet of ships, by hand and ox, overland from the Bosphorus and into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. It was a crazy, brilliant idea, and it broke the morale of the defenders. Now the city was under attack from both land and sea. The end was now only a matter of time. On May 29th, 1453, after weeks of relentless bombardment, the Ottomans launched their final assault. The Janissaries, now a disciplined and fearsome force, led the charge. The fighting was savage, and the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XIII, reportedly died fighting in the streets, a hero's end for a lost cause. Mehmed had finally done it. He had conquered Constantinople. He rode into the city in triumph, a young sultan who had achieved what so many others had failed to do. The fall of Constantinople was a moment of profound historical importance, a pivotal point that marked both the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern era. It also had a lasting legacy. Historians still argue whether the fall of the city caused a mass exodus of scholars to Europe, fueling the Renaissance. But what is clear is that the event sent shockwaves throughout the world. The last vestige of the Roman Empire was no more, and in its place, a new, powerful, and enduring empire was born. With the ultimate prize in his grasp, Mehmed II was faced with a new challenge: how to transform this conquered Christian city into a Muslim imperial capital. This was a task not of military might, but of immense vision and administrative genius. He had to take a city that had been the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity for 1,000 years and make it the new center of the Ottoman Empire. And he had to do it in a way that would be both symbolic and practical. It was like taking a rusty old car and turning it into a hyper-futuristic spaceship, all while the entire world was watching. Mehmed, true to his nickname, was a man of grand, sweeping gestures. His first order of business was to bring life back to the devastated city. He ordered a mass migration of people, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, from all over his empire to repopulate the new capital. He offered them incentives, land grants, and freedom of worship. This was a shrewd and pragmatic move. He knew that a capital was only as good as its people, and he needed a bustling, vibrant, and diverse city to match his imperial ambitions. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul was both a physical and a symbolic act. The city, which had a population of only a few thousand at the time of the conquest, was quickly revived. The first and most iconic act of transformation was the conversion of the magnificent Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, into a mosque. This was not just a religious act. but a profound political statement. The addition of minarets and a mihrab was a clear declaration that the city now belonged to a new faith and a new ruler. But Mehmed, a man of surprising intellectual curiosity, was not just about conversion. He was fascinated by the ancient world and saw himself as a successor to the Roman and Byzantine emperors. He adopted the title Kaiser-i-Rum, or Caesar of Rome, a move that infuriated his Christian rivals, but was a brilliant piece of political theater. He wasn't just a sultan, he was a legitimate emperor, the inheritor of 1,000 years of Roman history. He even invited Greek scholars and artists to his court and commissioned portraits of himself in the style of Roman emperors, a truly modern and self-aware act for the time. The city's reconstruction was a monumental undertaking. Mehmed ordered the construction of a new palace, the Topkapi Palace, which would become the heart of Ottoman administration for centuries to come. He commissioned mosques, markets, and public baths, literally building a new city on the bones of the old. He rebuilt the city's infrastructure and established new laws and institutions to govern it. The Kanun-i-Osmani, or the Ottoman Code of Laws, was formalized during his reign, bringing legal consistency to the vast and diverse empire. The new code was not just a collection of laws. It was an attempt to create a cohesive legal framework that blended Islamic law with ancient Turkish traditions and new imperial decrees. It was a clear signal that the empire was now a stable, institutional state, not just a collection of conquered territories. Mehmed's administrative reforms were just as impressive as his architectural ones. He centralized the government, giving more power to the Sultan and his Grand Vizier, and creating a more efficient bureaucracy. He also formalized the Janissary Corps, turning them into an even more formidable fighting force that was completely loyal to the Sultan. He also established a system of promotion based on merit, not birth, a policy that allowed talented men from all walks of life, including converted Christians, to rise to the highest ranks of government. This was a radical idea in a world dominated by feudal aristocracy, and it was a key factor in the empire's continued success. Historians still debate whether Mehmed's motivation for these changes was purely political, or if it was also a reflection of a personal belief in meritocracy. Either way, it worked, but Mehmed's ambition was not limited to Istanbul. He continued to expand his empire, conquering Serbia, Bosnia, and Albania in the Balkans, and a host of islands in the Aegean. He pushed his borders deep into Europe, a constant and terrifying threat to the Christian world. He was a ruthless and brilliant military commander, a Renaissance prince who also happened to be a sultan. He understood the power of technology and was a patron of the arts and sciences. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the Ottoman Golden Age. He had taken a bruised and battered state and, through sheer force of will and intellect, had transformed it into one of the most powerful and enduring empires in human history. He had turned a defeated, fragmented state into a modern, centralized power. He had conquered a city, but he had built an empire. Mehmed the Conqueror died in 1481, and with his passing, the empire held its breath. The reign of his successor, his son Bayezid II, was a dramatic departure from his father's relentless ambition and lightning-fast conquests. Where Mehmed was a man of war, Bayezid was a man of quiet contemplation, a scholar and a patron of the arts, who much preferred calligraphy and poetry to the clamor of the battlefield. It was a quieter, more thoughtful time for the empire, but it was not without its own set of internal problems. This was the first time that an Ottoman sultan faced a serious challenge to his throne from a sibling since the brutal interregnum. Bayezid's brother, Cem Sultan, was a charismatic and ambitious rival who believed he had a stronger claim to the throne. The two brothers went to war, a brief but intense conflict that Bayezid won. Cem fled, first to the Mamluks in Egypt, and then, in a twist of fate that reads like a spy novel, to the Knights of St. John in Rhodes. The knights, who were sworn enemies of the Ottomans, saw Cem not as a guest, but as a valuable bargaining chip. They kept him in comfortable captivity, a kind of gilded cage, and then passed him on to the Pope in Rome. For over a decade, Cem Sultan was a pawn in the high-stakes game of European diplomacy. He was a constant threat to Bayezid, who was forced to pay the knights and the Pope a considerable sum of money each year to ensure his brother remained a prisoner. This peculiar arrangement had a profound effect on Bayezid's foreign policy. With his brother still alive in Europe, a potential rival for the throne, Bayezid was much more cautious and less aggressive in his military campaigns. It was a kind of external blackmail that kept the Ottoman Empire from fully unleashing its military might on Europe for over a decade. It was a brilliant, if slightly underhanded piece of diplomacy from the European powers, and it was a source of constant frustration for Bayezid. Despite this unusual constraint, Bayezid's reign was a time of internal consolidation and cultural flourishing. He focused on strengthening the empire's institutions, a sensible move after the rapid expansion of his father's era. He promoted learning and the arts, sponsoring the construction of magnificent mosques and charitable complexes. He was a devout man and a bit of an ascetic, a stark contrast to the flamboyant personality of the conqueror. His quiet, scholarly demeanor earned him the nickname Veli, or the Saint. It was during his reign that the empire's cultural identity really started to take shape, a blend of Persian, Byzantine, and Turkish traditions that would define Ottoman art and architecture for centuries to come. His reign was not entirely peaceful, of course. He fought several campaigns against the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, and he faced a number of internal rebellions. But his focus was always on stability rather than conquest. One of the most remarkable and often overlooked events of Bayezid's reign was his response to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. In 1492, after the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada, they issued the Alhambra Decree, which gave the Jewish people of Spain a stark choice: convert to Christianity or leave the country. As hundreds of thousands of Sephardic Jews began a desperate search for refuge, Bayezid saw an opportunity. He sent out a fleet of ships to bring them to the Ottoman Empire, where they were welcomed and given religious freedom. It was a pragmatic and humane act that not only saved the community, but also enriched the empire with their skills and knowledge. Many of the refugees were merchants, bankers, and artisans, and they helped to boost the Ottoman economy and bring new ideas and technologies to the empire. It was a stark contrast to the religious intolerance that was sweeping through Europe at the time. This period, often seen as a historical lull, was a crucial time for the empire. It allowed the state to absorb its conquests, to build a stable administrative system, and to develop a unique cultural identity. Bayezid's quiet, cautious approach was the perfect antidote to his father's relentless military campaigns. It gave the empire a chance to breathe and to prepare for the next wave of expansion. It was a time of calm before the storm, a slow and deliberate period of internal growth that would lay the groundwork for the golden age of Ottoman power. But as Bayezid aged, the peace of his reign was shattered by the ambitions of his own son, Selim. And this time, there would be no civil war with a gentle scholar. This would be a brutal and uncompromising struggle for power. Bayezid Zebwan, the quiet, scholarly sultan, had hoped for a peaceful retirement, but the final years of his reign were anything but. His cautious and contemplative nature was a stark contrast to the ruthless ambition of his sons, who were all vying for the throne. The succession struggle was not just a family feud. It was a deep political and philosophical divide within the Ottoman state. One of his sons, a prince named Ahmed, was the favorite of the traditionalist faction, the ulema, religious scholars, and many of the old Turkish families. But his youngest son, Selim, was a different kind of man entirely. He was a hardened warrior, a fanatical Sunni Muslim, and a favorite of the Janissaries, who were tired of the long peace and yearned for the spoils of conquest. The stage was set for a final, decisive clash between a father who craved stability and a son who was a human thunderstorm. In a move of stunning and shocking defiance, Selim openly rebelled against his father in 1511. He marched his army to Istanbul, but Bayezid, who was a decent military commander in his own right, met him and forced him to retreat. It looked like Selim had failed, but his defeat was only temporary. He had the support of the Janissaries, and they were the real power behind the throne. They surrounded the palace and demanded that Bayezid abdicate in favor of his son. The old sultan, weary and facing a mutinous army, had no choice but to step down. He had held onto the throne for 30 years, but in the end, the will of the Janissaries and the will of a ruthless son proved stronger. Bayezid II died shortly after, likely of natural causes. But there's always a whisper of foul play with these kinds of things. Selim, now Sultan, wasted no time in consolidating his power. In a move that earned him the nickname Yavuz, or the Grim, he immediately had all of his brothers and their sons executed. It was a brutal act of fratricide, but it was also a grimly effective way of ensuring that there would be no civil war during his reign. The problem of succession was solved, at least for a generation. Selim was a man of action, a complete and total reversal of his father's personality. He had no interest in European affairs and no time for the quiet intellectual pursuits of his father's court. His gaze was fixed on the east and south, on the powerful Shiite Safavid Empire of Persia, and the ancient Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. The conflict with the Safavids was not just about territory. It was a religious and ideological war between Sunni and Shia Islam. The Safavids, under their Shah Ismail I, were rapidly expanding and converting their subjects to Shia Islam, a move that Selim saw as a direct threat to the Sunni heartland of his empire. In 1514, the two armies met at the Battle of Chaldiran. The Ottoman army, with its superior Janissary infantry and its massive cannons, utterly annihilated the Safavid cavalry. It was a decisive victory that crippled the Safavids and temporarily halted their expansion. It also showed the world that the Ottoman military machine was still the most formidable force in the region. With his eastern flank secured, Selim turned his full attention to the south, to the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. The Mamluks, who had ruled Egypt and Syria for centuries, were a formidable power in their own right. They controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and they were the masters of the spice trade. Selim saw them as a rival to Ottoman authority and a potential threat to his empire. The war that followed was short and brutal. Selim's army, once again relying on its superior firepower and its disciplined janissaries, defeated the Mamluk army in a series of decisive battles. By 1517, he had captured Cairo and brought the entire Mamluk Sultanate under Ottoman rule. This victory was a game-changer. It gave the Ottoman Empire control of the crucial trade routes between Asia and Europe, and it made them the dominant power in the Islamic world. But the most significant part of the conquest was not the land or the trade routes. It was the religious authority. The last Abbasid Caliph, who had been living as a ceremonial figure in Cairo under Mamluk protection, was brought to Istanbul. The Ottoman sultans now claimed the title of Caliph, the spiritual leader of all Sunni Muslims. This was a massive symbolic victory, and it gave the Ottomans a new level of religious and political legitimacy. They were no longer just a powerful empire. They were the guardians of Islam, the protectors of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Selim IV, in his short but explosive reign of only 8 years, had almost doubled the size of the empire and had transformed it from a regional power into a truly global one. He had secured the East and the South, and he had laid the groundwork for the most glorious chapter in Ottoman history, a chapter that would be written by his son. Selim I, the Sultan who earned his moniker, the Grim, had secured the Ottoman Empire's borders, amassed immense wealth, and most importantly, laid the groundwork for his successor to be a true world power. But his reign was short, and his legacy was immediately inherited by his only son, Suleiman. This was a different kind of sultan. He was a man of immense talent and ambition, but he wasn't just a warrior. He was a statesman, a patron of the arts, and a legislator who would oversee what is now widely considered the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. He would be known to his own people as Kanuni, the lawgiver, but to the West, he would be forever immortalized as Suleiman the Magnificent. His reign, which began in 1520 and lasted for 46 years, was a period of unrivaled power, wealth, and cultural brilliance, a time when the Ottoman state reached the zenith of its influence. Suleiman's early reign was a whirlwind of military triumphs. He was a brilliant military commander who personally led his armies on campaign, just like his ancestors. His first major campaign was the capture of Belgrade in 1521, a fortress that had withstood every Ottoman siege since the days of Mehmed the Conqueror. Its fall was a huge blow to the Kingdom of Hungary, and a clear signal that a new, more powerful sultan was on the throne. The next year, he laid siege to the island of Rhodes, a fortress held by the Knights of St. John, those same knights who had held his uncle, Shem Sultan, captive. The siege was long and brutal, but in the end, the Ottomans prevailed. The knights were allowed to leave, and eventually settled on the island of Malta. But the victory secured Ottoman control over the eastern Mediterranean, but the most significant victory of Suleiman's early reign, and one of the most famous battles in Ottoman history, came in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs. The Hungarian army, under the command of the young King Louis II, met Suleiman's forces on the plains of southern Hungary. The battle was a complete and utter rout. The Ottomans, with their overwhelming numbers and their superior firepower, utterly annihilated the Hungarian army. King Louis II was killed, and the Kingdom of Hungary ceased to exist as a unified state. The victory opened the way for the Ottomans to advance deep into Central Europe, and they marched all the way to Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 was a moment of immense historical importance. It was the first time an Ottoman army had attempted to take a major European capital, and it sent shivers of fear throughout the continent. But the siege was a failure. The Ottoman army was not prepared for a long siege, and the city was well defended. The early autumn rains turned the roads to mud, making it impossible to bring up the heavy siege cannons, and the Ottomans were forced to retreat. The failure to capture Vienna was a significant setback, but it didn't slow Suleiman's overall advance. He continued to expand his empire on all fronts. In the east, he fought a long series of wars against the Safavids of Persia, capturing Baghdad in 1534 and bringing much of Mesopotamia under Ottoman control. This victory was a major symbolic and strategic coup, as it gave the Ottomans control over the ancient city and the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. In the Mediterranean, he commanded a powerful navy under the legendary Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, who established Ottoman naval supremacy and made the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake. The Ottomans even began to explore and raid in the Indian Ocean, a truly global reach for a state that had started out as a tiny bey-like. But Suleiman's reign was not just about war. He was a man of profound intellectual curiosity, and he was a lavish patron of the arts and architecture. He commissioned the legendary architect Mimar Sinan to build some of the most beautiful and iconic structures in Istanbul and throughout the empire. The Süleymaniye Mosque, a magnificent complex that includes a school, a hospital, and a public kitchen, is a testament to the cultural and architectural brilliance of his reign. He was a poet and a scholar, and he gathered some of the most brilliant minds of the Islamic world to his court. The empire was not just wealthy and powerful, it was a center of learning, art, and culture. It was a time of confidence and stability, a time when the Ottoman Empire truly believed that it was the center of the world. Suleiman had inherited a strong state from his father, but he had taken it to a level of power and prestige that was almost unimaginable. Suleiman's long reign wasn't just about military conquests and architectural wonders. He was as much a bureaucrat and a legislator as he was a general, and it's his internal reforms that truly earned him the moniker Kanuni, the lawgiver. He understood that a vast multicultural empire could not be held together by force alone. It needed a cohesive legal framework, and he set about creating a comprehensive code of law that would govern everything from taxation to criminal justice. He didn't just make up new laws, he codified and streamlined the existing laws, making them fairer and more efficient. He issued a series of legal decrees, or kanunim, that addressed the chronic problem of bribery and corruption and ensured that justice was administered fairly, regardless of a person's social standing or religious background. This legal system, which combined elements of Islamic law with traditional Turkish laws and new imperial decrees, was a masterpiece of political pragmatism. It was one of the key factors that gave the empire a sense of stability and order, and it ensured the loyalty of his diverse subjects. But his reign was also a time of profound cultural and intellectual flourishing. Suleiman, himself a poet who wrote under the pen name Muhibi, was a lavish patron of the arts. He created a new academy for artists, a kind of government-funded atelier, and he encouraged the development of a unique Ottoman style that blended Persian, Byzantine, and Turkish influences. It was a golden age for miniature painting, ceramics, and textiles, and the quality of the work produced during his reign was simply breathtaking. The most famous example of this cultural renaissance was the work of the architect Mimar Sinan, a converted Christian who rose to become the chief architect of the empire. Sinan was a true architectural genius, a kind of Ottoman Michelangelo, and his work defined the style of the Ottoman mosque for centuries to come. His masterpieces, like the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul and the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, were not just places of worship. They were expressions of imperial power and cultural confidence. They were massive, elegant structures with soaring domes and slender minarets that seemed to touch the sky. It's hard to overstate the importance of his work. He was a one-man architectural revolution. Suleiman's private life, however, was a source of drama and intrigue that could rival any soap opera. The central character in this drama was Hürrem Sultan, a woman of immense influence and power. She was a Ukrainian girl who had been captured by Tatar raiders and sold into the Sultan's harem. But she was not just a concubine. She was brilliant, ambitious, and incredibly charming. She captivated Suleiman and became his favorite, a position of immense power. She eventually broke 1,000 years of Ottoman tradition by becoming his legal wife, a move that sent shockwaves through the court. She was a political force in her own right, and she used her influence to advance her own children and to promote her favorite officials, often at the expense of her rivals. She was a fascinating and at times terrifying figure who showed the world that power in the Ottoman Empire wasn't just confined to the men. This new dynamic created a complex and sometimes deadly rivalry within the court, particularly between Hürrem's sons and the eldest son of Suleiman, a popular and talented prince named Mustafa. Mustafa was the heir apparent, and he was the favorite of the Janissaries and the old Turkish families. But Hürrem, determined to see one of her own sons on the throne, used her influence to turn Suleiman against him. She convinced the Sultan that Mustafa was plotting against him, a common accusation in a court filled with intrigue. Historians still argue whether Mustafa was actually guilty of treason, but what is clear is that he was a victim of a political power play. In 1553, Suleiman, fearing a potential coup, had Mustafa executed. It was a tragic and shocking event that devastated the people, who had loved and revered the young prince. This act, whether justified or not, set a dangerous precedent and revealed the darker side of a monarch who was otherwise so magnificent. The man who had been a just, and compassionate lawgiver to his people, was also capable of immense cruelty. The death of Mustafa cleared the way for Hurrem's son, Selim, to inherit the throne. He was not the most capable of the Sultan's sons, and his lack of experience would later contribute to the slow decline of the empire. Suleiman's reign was a time of unparalleled glory, but the seeds of the empire's future troubles were also sown during this golden age. It was the peak, and as any historian will tell you, a peak is usually followed by a long, slow descent. With the death of Suleiman the Magnificent in 1566, the Ottoman Empire entered a new and much less glorious phase of its history. His successor, his son Selim II, was a weak and indolent man who had little interest in military affairs or the hard work of governance. To the Ottoman people, he was known as Selim the Sot, or the Drunkard, and his reign was a stark and immediate contrast to the 46 years of his father's relentless activity. This period marked the beginning of a long, slow decline that would last for centuries. This isn't to say the empire collapsed overnight. The sheer momentum of Suleiman's golden age and the strength of the institutions he had built meant that the empire would continue to function and even expand for a time. But the leadership at the top, that key ingredient of personal greatness, was gone. The Google Cap, Veep, the most significant event of Selim Teki's reign and a major turning point in the Ottoman-European naval rivalry, was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. The Ottoman fleet, having recently captured Cyprus from the Venetians, was sailing in the Mediterranean when it was met by a Holy League armada, a massive naval coalition of European powers led by Spain and Venice. The battle was a bloody, chaotic, and brutal affair, a clash of over 400 galleys and over 100,000 men. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a kind of medieval marine combat, and the outcome was a complete and utter disaster for the Ottomans. The Holy League Armada, with its superior galleys and its more disciplined sailors, destroyed a huge portion of the Ottoman fleet. It was the first major naval defeat for the Ottomans in over a century, and it was a massive symbolic blow. While the Ottoman state was able to rebuild its fleet in a matter of months, a testament to its immense resources, the victory was a huge psychological boost for Europe and a sign that the Ottoman Empire was no longer invincible at sea. It marked a turning point in the balance of power in the Mediterranean, a slow but definite shift away from Ottoman naval dominance. The real decline, however, was not military. It was political and administrative, and it had a lot to do with the new role of the Sultan. Selim II was the first Sultan to delegate most of the day-to-day work of government to his Grand Vizier, a brilliant and capable man named Sokolu Mehmed Pasha. Sokolu was a kind of last gasp of the Golden Age, a master administrator who kept the empire running smoothly despite the incompetence of his master. But his presence also set a dangerous precedent. The Sultan, who had been the central figure of the state, was now receding into the background, becoming a more distant and ceremonial figure. The palace politics, a messy and often deadly game of intrigue, began to take on a new level of importance. The power vacuum left by the absent Sultan was filled by the Grand Viziers and more, by the women of the royal household, a period that historians would later call the Sultanate of Women. The system of succession also began to change, and not for the better. The old practice of fratricide, while brutal, had ensured that the most ruthless and capable prince would inherit the throne. But it was a system that led to a great deal of bloodshed. Starting with the reign of Ahmed Tintur in the early 17th century, the practice of fratricide was officially ended. Instead, the eldest male member of the royal family would inherit the throne, a system known as ekberiyet or seniority. Kuiti. This sounds much more civilized, but it had a disastrous side effect. The heir apparent was no longer a well-traveled prince with experience in provincial administration and military campaigns. Instead, he was kept in a palace cage known as the cafes, a kind of gilded prison where he was confined for years, sometimes decades, with little contact with the outside world. Can you imagine living your entire life in a small, gilded room with no friends and no political training, and then one day you are suddenly told that you are the emperor of a vast and complex empire? The sultans who emerged from the cafes were often mentally and emotionally unprepared for the job, and many were completely insane. The quality of leadership at the top began to plummet, and the empire, for the first time, was led by a series of weak and often deranged rulers. The rot had truly set in, with the sultans now sequestered in their gilded cages and the quality of leadership plummeting. A power vacuum opened up at the very heart of the empire, and into that vacuum stepped a new kind of power broker, the women of the royal household. This period, roughly from the mid-16th to the mid-17th centuries, is known as the Sultanate of Women, a time when the mothers, wives, and grandmothers of the sultans exercised an unprecedented and often decisive influence over state affairs. It's a fascinating and often misunderstood chapter of Ottoman history. These women were not elected officials. They were not military commanders. Their power came from their proximity to the Sultan, and they used their influence, their political savvy, and their deep knowledge of court intrigue to place their own favorites in positions of power and to push their own agendas. It was a kind of proto-feminist moment, if you squint, a time when women were able to wield immense power in a fiercely patriarchal society. The most powerful of these women was Kusum Sultan, a woman of Greek origin who was one of the most influential figures in Ottoman history. She arrived at the court as a slave girl and rose through the ranks to become the chief consort of Sultan Ahmed III. After his death, she became the mother of two sultans and the grandmother of a third, and she served as a regent for her sons. For decades, she was the de facto ruler of the empire, a shadowy figure who controlled the grand viziers and the military from behind the scenes. Historians still argue whether she was a benevolent force for stability or a ruthless and power-hungry manipulator. But what is clear is that she was an absolute master of court politics. She amassed immense wealth and used her influence to build mosques and charitable foundations. But she also engaged in a series of deadly rivalries with other women in the harem and other factions at court. Her long reign, if you can call it that, was a time of immense internal struggle and political instability. The rise of the harem as a center of political power had a number of long-term consequences. The focus of the court shifted from military campaigns and foreign policy to internal palace politics. The grand viziers, who had once been powerful figures in their own right, were now often just puppets of the Sultan's mother or wife. The Janissaries, who were once the disciplined and loyal fighting force of the empire, were now a law unto themselves. They had a huge amount of political power, and they used it to demand higher pay, to remove viziers, and to place their own candidates on the throne. They were no longer just an army. They were a kingmaker, a kind of Praetorian guard that could, and often did, decide who ruled the empire. Their constant demands and their frequent revolts were a major source of instability and drained the imperial treasury. It's like a sports team, where the players are constantly fighting with the coach and the general manager, and the only person who can do anything about it is the owner who lives in a penthouse apartment and never shows up for practice. The owner, in this case, being the Sultan in his gilded cage. The decline was not just political, it was also economic. The great trade routes that had made the Ottoman Empire so wealthy were now being bypassed by the new sea routes around Africa, thanks to the voyages of discovery by the Portuguese and the Spanish. The empire was no longer the sole gatekeeper of trade between Asia and Europe, and its once dominant position was slowly being eroded. The Ottomans were also falling behind technologically. The military was still formidable, but it was no longer on the cutting edge. European powers were developing new kinds of firearms and new kinds of tactics that the Ottomans were slow to adopt. The empire was a great, slumbering giant, resting on the laurels of its past greatness, while the rest of the world was quickly changing. It was a period of stagnation, of slow decay, a time when the empire was still powerful, but the cracks were beginning to show. The great, confident roar of Suleiman's golden age had been replaced by a kind of low, political hum, a constant murmur of intrigue and palace whispers. The Sultanate of Women and the rise of the Janissaries had plunged the Ottoman Empire into a century of stagnation and political chaos. By the mid-17th century, the state was in dire need of a strong hand, a leader who could reverse the tide of decline and restore some semblance of order. And in a surprising turn of events, that strong hand came not from the Sultan himself, who was still often a young and inexperienced figure, but from a family of brilliant and ruthless grand viziers. This period, known as the Köprülü era, was a brief but vital resurgence for the empire, a kind of temporary CPR that gave it a second wind. The family, which came from Albania, included Köprülü Mehmed Pasha and his son, Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, and they were masters of administration and military strategy. They were essentially the CEOs of the Ottoman Empire, and their job was to fix a broken company. When Köprülü Mehmed Pasha was appointed Grand Vizier in 1656, he was a man in his 80s, but he was as sharp as a tack. He made the Sultan agree to a radical condition. He would have absolute power to do whatever was necessary to restore order, and he would not be questioned or second-guessed by anyone, not even the Sultan. It was a blank check for reform, and he used it to full effect. His first order of business was to purge the corrupt officials and military leaders who had been bleeding the state dry. He was a man of immense cruelty and immense efficiency, and he executed thousands of people, often on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. His reforms were ruthless, but they worked. He restored discipline to the Janissaries, stabilized the economy, and put an end to the political infighting that had been plaguing the court for so long. He wasn't a sultan, but he ruled like one, and the empire, for the first time in a century, had a sense of direction. His son, Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, who inherited the position of Grand Vizier, was a much more cultured and refined man, but he was just as effective. He was a great military commander, and he led the Ottoman armies to a series of important victories against the Habsburgs and the Venetians. He also continued his father's work of reform, focusing on legal and administrative improvements. He was a great patron of learning and the arts, and he was known for his love of libraries and his collection of rare manuscripts. Under his leadership, the empire once again felt confident and powerful. This period saw the last great wave of Ottoman expansion into Europe, and it seemed for a brief moment that the empire might once again be a rising power. It was a time of immense hope and optimism, a feeling that the long, slow decline had been reversed. But the Köprülü revival, for all its brilliance, was ultimately a temporary fix. It was a system that relied on the personal genius of a single family, and it did not address the deeper, structural problems that were slowly eating away at the empire. The problem was that the sultans were still being raised in the cafes, still being kept away from the realities of governance and military command. This meant that every time a brilliant Grand Vizier died, the empire was faced with a leadership vacuum. The next sultan, if he was a good man, would have to appoint a new Grand Vizier. And if he wasn't, he might appoint a useless one. This was a system that was completely reliant on individual talent, and it was a fragile and unsustainable way to run an empire. It was a bit like a car with a broken engine that relies on a single mechanic to constantly fix it. Eventually, the mechanic will get tired or die, and the car will stop working. And so, by the end of the 17th century, the empire was once again a great military power, but it was still a deeply flawed and unstable state. The Köprülü family had given it a century of relative stability, and they had led it to a series of important military victories. But the fundamental problems were still there. The military was still plagued by indiscipline, the economy was still stagnant, and the sultans were still being raised in an environment that was not conducive to good leadership. The stage was set for the next great crisis, a crisis that would expose all the underlying weaknesses of the empire and put a definitive end to the brief period of resurgence. The Köprülü family had managed to restore the empire's military prestige, but their success, like a sugar rush, was ultimately fleeting. The deep-seated problems, the weak sultans, the corruptible janissaries, the stagnant economy, had not been solved, merely papered over. It was only a matter of time before the empire's fundamental weaknesses were exposed in a truly catastrophic way. And that moment arrived in 1683 with the siege of Vienna. This wasn't just another military campaign. It was a final, desperate roll of the dice, a last attempt to reclaim the imperial glory of Suleiman the Magnificent. The Grand Vizier, Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, was a member of the Köprülü family, but he was a man of immense hubris. He was convinced that he could succeed where Suleiman had failed, and he led a colossal army, estimated at over 150,000 men, to the gates of Vienna. This was a massive show of force, a grand, theatrical gesture that was meant to strike fear into the hearts of every European monarch. The siege was long and brutal. The Ottoman army, with its massive cannons and its endless supply of sappers, pounded the city's walls relentlessly. But the defenders, under the command of Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, fought with incredible courage and determination. They held out for 2 long months, desperately waiting for a relief army. And that relief army came, a formidable coalition of Polish and German forces under the command of the brilliant Polish king, John III Sobieski. They arrived just in time on September 12th, 1683, and launched a massive surprise attack on the Ottoman army. The battle was a complete and utter disaster for the Ottomans. The European forces, with their superior cavalry and their more advanced tactics, utterly annihilated the Ottoman army. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, fled the battlefield, but it was a temporary reprieve. He was later executed by the Sultan, an act that symbolized the complete failure of the campaign. The defeat was a catastrophic blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. It was the definitive end of the Ottoman military threat in Central Europe. The once feared Turkish juggernaut had been stopped, and for the first time, the Ottoman Empire was seen not as a rising power, but as a wounded beast. The failure at Vienna was the beginning of a long and painful period of military decline. The war that followed, known as the Great Turkish War, was a slow, grinding war of attrition that would last for 16 years. The Holy League, a coalition of European powers that included Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia, was finally united, and they saw their chance to push the Ottomans out of Europe for good. The war was fought on multiple fronts, in Hungary, in the Balkans, and in the Aegean. The Ottomans, who had been so successful for so long, were now fighting a war on their own soil. Their military machine, which had been so formidable, was no longer a match for the new, more professional armies of Europe. European states were now led by standing armies and professional officers, and their tactics were more advanced and disciplined than the Ottoman feudal cavalry, the Janissaries, who had once been the elite of the military, were now a corrupt and undisciplined rabble, more interested in palace intrigues than in fighting for the empire. The war was a long, humiliating series of defeats for the Ottomans, a painful lesson that the world had changed, and they had not. They lost Hungary, Transylvania, and much of Serbia to the Austrians. They lost territory to the Venetians in the Aegean, and they lost land to the Poles. The once invincible empire was now fighting for its very survival. The war was so costly, and the losses so great, that the Ottomans were finally forced to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was a landmark moment in Ottoman history. It was the first time that the Ottomans had to formally cede large swaths of territory to the European powers. It was a humiliating and decisive defeat, a clear signal that the balance of power had shifted. The Ottomans were no longer the aggressors. They were the defenders, and from this point forward, they would be fighting a losing battle to hold on to what they had left. The long, slow decline had been confirmed, and there was no going back. The glorious past was just that, the past. The humiliating defeat at the Battle of Vienna and the subsequent losses of the Great Turkish War forced the Ottomans into a long and painful period of self-reflection. The empire's ruling class, for the first time in centuries, was forced to confront the harsh reality that Europe was no longer a collection of squabbling kingdoms to be easily conquered. It was a continent of powerful, well-organized states with modern armies and navies, and the Ottoman military machine was no longer the most formidable force on the continent. The balance of power had decisively shifted, and the Ottomans were now a secondary power, a fact that was both shocking and deeply demoralizing. This period, known as the Tulip Era, was a brief, peaceful interlude in the long decline, a moment of cultural and social flourishing that also saw the first timid attempts to westernize the empire. The name Tulip Era comes from the Dutch tulip, which was a symbol of immense wealth and luxury at the time. The elite of the Ottoman court, under Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier, Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, developed a kind of decadent, European-inspired style. They built elaborate palaces, fountains, and pleasure gardens, and they cultivated a love of the arts and literature that was a deliberate departure from the austere, militaristic style of the past. The court became a playground for the wealthy and the powerful, a place of lavish parties and extravagant entertainment. It was a time of peace, and with peace came a new kind of cosmopolitan culture. The empire, which had been so focused on war for so long, was now turning its attention to the finer things in life. This was a welcome change, to be sure, but it was also a sign of a deeper, more troubling problem. The Ottoman elite were more interested in mimicking the superficial trappings of European culture than in adopting the underlying scientific and military innovations that had made Europe so powerful. But the Tulip Era was not just about tulips and parties. It was also a time of cautious and often reluctant reform. The Ottoman state, having been humbled by its military defeats, was forced to admit that it had fallen behind. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, established a number of diplomatic missions to European capitals like Paris and Vienna. Their job was not just to conduct diplomacy, but to study European technology and society. They sent back detailed reports on everything from military tactics to printing presses, and these reports were an important source of information about the rapidly changing world. It was during this period that the first official printing press was established in the Ottoman Empire, a technological innovation that had been available in Europe for centuries. It was a hugely important moment, but the printing press was only allowed to print non-religious books, and it was a cautious and limited step towards modernization. The religious establishment, the powerful ulema, were still deeply skeptical of European ideas, and they often resisted any attempts at radical reform. The Tulip Era was a time of immense cultural and artistic brilliance, but it was also a time of deep social and political tension. The people, who were often poor and struggling, resented the lavish spending of the court. The Janissaries, who had a huge amount of political power, were also deeply unhappy. They saw the Sultan's fascination with European culture as a sign of weakness, and they resented the power of the Grand Vizier. The resentment finally boiled over in 1730 in a rebellion known as the Patrona Halil Revolt, a popular uprising led by a Janissary who was a former bath attendant. The rebels, who were supported by the Janissaries and the religious establishment, stormed the palace, killed the Grand Vizier, and forced Sultan Ahmed III to abdicate. The Tulip Era was over, and the brief, glorious period of peace and cultural flowering was at an end. It was a stark reminder that the empire was still deeply conservative, and that any attempt at modernization, no matter how cautious, would be met with fierce resistance. The Ottoman Empire was a great, ancient ship, and it was slowly taking on water. But every time someone tried to patch the hole, someone else would come along and rip the patch off. The Patrona Halil revolt of 1730 had a devastating effect. It put a temporary end to the tulip era and its timid attempts at westernization, and it was a clear sign that the conservative forces within the empire would not tolerate any radical reform. But the empire's military defeats in the subsequent decades, especially against the Russians, were so humiliating and so profound that they finally forced the ruling class to accept that a more comprehensive reform was necessary. The old way of doing things, the old reliance on tradition and religious dogma, was simply no longer working. The empire was an antique in a world of modern machines, and it was slowly being torn apart by its more agile and powerful neighbors. This realization, a slow and painful one, would eventually lead to the most ambitious and comprehensive reform movement in the empire's history, the Tanzimat, or reorganization. The Tanzimat began in 1839 with the promulgation of the Gülhane Edict, a kind of Ottoman Bill of Rights issued by Sultan Abdülmecid I. The edict, which had been drafted by the reformist statesman Mustafa Rashid Pasha, was a radical departure from the old way of doing things. It promised to guarantee the life, property, and honor of all citizens, regardless of their religion or ethnicity. It was a revolutionary idea in a society that had always been organized along religious and communal lines. The edict also promised to reform the tax system, to regularize military conscription, and to create a more efficient and less corrupt bureaucracy. It was a bold and idealistic attempt to create a more modern, European-style state, a state where all citizens were equal before the law. The reforms were not just about legal codes. They were about creating a new kind of Ottoman subject, a modern citizen who was loyal to the state rather than to his religious or ethnic community. The Tanzimat reformers understood that the empire's diversity, which had once been its strength, was now becoming a liability. They created new schools and universities, a kind of parallel education system that taught Western science and languages alongside traditional Islamic subjects. They reformed the military, abolishing the janissaries and creating a new professional army based on the European model. They built a new, more efficient state bureaucracy with professional civil servants and ministries that were based on the European model. They even reformed the currency and the banking system, and they began to build a modern infrastructure of roads, bridges, and telegraph lines. It was a top-down, systematic attempt to modernize the empire from the ground up, and it was the most significant reform effort in Ottoman history. But the Tanzimat was not without its problems. The reforms were expensive, and they put a huge strain on the imperial treasury. The empire, which was already deeply in debt to European banks, had to borrow more and more money to pay for the new army and the new bureaucracy. This put the empire in a precarious financial position and gave the European powers a huge amount of leverage over Ottoman policy. The reforms were also deeply unpopular with the conservative elements of society. the religious establishment, and the old Turkish families who saw them as a betrayal of Islamic tradition. They viewed the new laws and the new institutions as a kind of cultural capitulation to the West, a sign that the Ottoman state had lost its way. The Tanzimat reformers, for their part, were a small, enlightened elite who had little support from the general population. They were trying to change a society that was not yet ready to change, and their reforms were often resisted and undermined by the very people who were supposed to be implementing them. Despite the resistance, the Tanzimat was a turning point. It set the empire on a new, modernizing path, a path that it would not abandon. It created a new kind of intellectual and political class, a generation of educated young men who were deeply committed to the idea of a modern Ottoman state. These young men would later go on to lead the Young Turk Revolution, and they would be the ones who would finally bring an end to the Ottoman Empire. The Tanzimat was a beginning and an end, a desperate attempt to save a crumbling empire that ultimately laid the groundwork for its final collapse. It was a noble effort, to be sure, but it was also a tragic one, a kind of last-ditch effort to save a ship that was already sinking. The Tanzimat reforms, for all their idealism and effort, had failed to halt the empire's slow, agonizing decline. They had created a new, educated class of Ottoman citizens, but they had not solved the deep-seated problems of political instability and financial insolvency. By the late 19th century, the empire was a mess. It was known as the sick man of Europe, a derisive but tragically accurate nickname given by the Russians. The great European powers, who had always been a little nervous about a revived Ottoman Empire, were now circling it like vultures, waiting for the patient to finally die so they could carve up its remains. It was a humiliating time for a state that had once been the master of the Mediterranean. Into this maelstrom of political and social turmoil stepped Sultan Abdul Hamid II, a ruler who would try a different approach to save the empire. He would rule for over 30 years, and his reign would be a study in contradictions, a period of intense autocracy and ruthless suppression of dissent, but also a time of continued modernization and centralization. Abdul Hamid came to power in 1876, a time of immense crisis. The empire was bankrupt, a major war with Russia was on the horizon, and the liberal, reformist intellectuals of the Tanzimat era had just forced the previous sultan to accept the first Ottoman constitution. Abdul Hamid, a pragmatic and deeply paranoid man, initially accepted the constitution and even appointed a parliament. But his commitment to constitutional rule was short-lived. He quickly saw that the constitution, with its limits on his power, was a direct threat to his authority. When the war with Russia broke out and proved to be a disaster, he used it as an excuse to suspend the constitution, dissolve the parliament, and establish a personal autocracy. He was a micromanager who ruled the empire with an iron fist, relying on a vast network of spies and informants to crush any and all dissent. He was a tyrant, to be sure, but he was also a man who was deeply committed to the survival of his empire. Despite his authoritarian rule, Abdul Hamid was not a man who was opposed to all forms of modernization. On the contrary, he continued many of the reforms of the Tanzimat era. He understood that in order to survive in a world of powerful European states, the empire needed a modern infrastructure and a modern military. He oversaw the construction of thousands of miles of telegraph lines and the creation of a modern railway network, including the famous Baghdad Railway, which was a major strategic project that connected Istanbul to the Middle East. He built new schools and universities, and he established a number of professional schools for civil servants and military officers. He was also a patron of the arts and sciences, and he was the first sultan to send Ottoman students to study in Europe in large numbers. He was a reformer, but he was a reformer on his own terms. His goal was not to create a liberal, democratic state, but to create a strong, centralized, and modern empire that was still under the absolute control of the Sultan. His reign was also a time of increasing Islamic conservatism. Abdul Hamid was a deeply religious man, and he used his position as caliph to rally the support of Muslims throughout the world. He promoted a pan-Islamic ideology, a kind of global Muslim solidarity, which he hoped would give him a new source of legitimacy and a new political weapon to use against the European powers. He saw this as a way to unite his diverse and often fractious subjects, and to show the world that the Ottoman Empire was still a great Islamic power. Historians still argue whether his pan-Islamism was a genuine belief or a cynical political tool. But what is clear is that it was an important part of his long and complex reign. He was a man who saw threats everywhere, from the liberal reformers at home to the powerful European empires abroad, and he used a combination of repression, modernization, and religious appeals to hold his crumbling empire together. But his reign, for all its ruthless efficiency, was ultimately a temporary fix. The seeds of revolution had already been sown, and they were about to come to a full and bloody bloom. Abdul Hamid II's reign of autocratic control and centralized power was ultimately a house of cards. He had successfully suppressed dissent, but he had done nothing to solve the underlying problems of the empire. On the contrary, his paranoia and his ruthless repression had only served to unite his enemies against him. The new generation of Ottoman intellectuals, military officers, and bureaucrats who had been educated in the modern schools and universities of the Tanzimat era were deeply resentful of his tyranny. They wanted a return to constitutional rule, and they organized themselves into a secret society known as the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, though they were more famously known as the Young Turks. They were a diverse group of reformers, but they were all united in their goal: to overthrow the Sultan's autocracy and restore the 1876 Constitution. In 1908, the Young Turks, with the support of a significant portion of the army, launched a bloodless revolution. They marched their troops to Istanbul and demanded that Abdul Hamid restore the constitution and reconvene the parliament. Abdul Hamid, a man who had faced down rebellions and assassins for over 30 years, knew when he was beaten he had no choice but to acquiesce, and he publicly announced the restoration of the Constitution, a shocking and humiliating reversal for a man who had ruled as an absolute monarch for so long. The news of the revolution was met with wild celebrations throughout the empire. People danced in the streets, and a new era of freedom and liberalism seemed to have dawned. For a brief, glorious period, the Ottoman Empire was a constitutional monarchy, a modern, democratic state. The various ethnic and religious groups that had been oppressed for so long were now united in a shared sense of optimism. It was a beautiful and tragically short-lived moment. But the Young Turk Revolution was not just a story of hope and liberation. It was also a story of immense political instability. The Young Turks were a broad coalition, and they quickly fractured into different factions with different agendas. They were also deeply inexperienced in the business of running a government. And worst of all, their revolution, which had been so glorious in its ideals, unleashed a firestorm of nationalism that would tear the empire apart. The various ethnic groups who had been promised equality now saw an opportunity to demand independence. The Greeks, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, and the Albanians all wanted their own nation states, and the fragile peace that had been held in place by the Sultan's iron fist was now shattered. It was a classic case of be careful what you wish for. The Ottoman Empire had been held together by a combination of force and tradition. And now that both of those things were gone, the empire was starting to disintegrate. In 1909, Abdul Hamid, in a final desperate attempt to reclaim his throne, launched a counter-revolution. He rallied the support of conservative and religious elements of the army, and for a few days, it looked like he might succeed. But the Young Turks, with the support of the majority of the army, marched on Istanbul again, crushed the revolt, and formally deposed the old sultan. He was replaced by his much more pliable brother, Mehmed Fev. The Young Turks, now firmly in control, set about consolidating their power. They were an idealistic bunch, but they were also deeply nationalistic. They believed that the only way to save the empire was to create a modern, centralized, and Turkish state. This new emphasis on Turkish nationalism, a policy known as Turkification, was deeply offensive to the empire's non-Turkish subjects, and it would only serve to accelerate the collapse of the empire. The Young Turks had started out as liberal reformers, but they had now become ruthless nationalists, a chilling transformation that would have tragic consequences. Their revolution, which had been meant to save the empire, was now setting the stage for its final, definitive end. The Young Turks' revolution, intended to save the empire, had instead opened a Pandora's box of problems. The newfound political freedom, coupled with the rising tide of nationalism across Europe, had given the empire's various ethnic groups a powerful new voice, and they were all using that voice to demand independence. The great powers of Europe, who had been a little miffed at the Young Turks' newfound confidence, saw an opportunity to capitalize on the chaos. The resulting conflagration would be known as the Balkan Wars, a series of two brutal, back-to-back conflicts that would almost completely strip the Ottoman Empire of its remaining European territories. It was a humiliating and decisive end to a centuries-long presence on the continent. The First Balkan War, which began in 1912, was a classic case of opportunism. The Balkan League, a coalition of Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, saw that the Ottoman Empire was a political and military shambles. They were encouraged by Russia, who was eager to see the Ottomans pushed out of the Balkans for good. The war was a complete disaster for the Ottomans. The Balkan armies, which had been trained by European officers and were more motivated and disciplined than the Ottoman army, utterly annihilated the Ottoman forces in a series of shocking and decisive victories. The fighting was fierce, and the Ottoman military, which was still undergoing a painful and chaotic period of reform, was simply no match for the combined forces of the Balkan League. The Ottoman army was routed, and they were forced to retreat all the way back to the outskirts of Istanbul. It was a stunning and swift defeat, a clear signal that the great ancient empire was on its last legs. The war ended in 1913 with the Treaty of London, a humiliating document that stripped the Ottoman Empire of almost all of its European territories. They lost Macedonia, Albania, and most of Thrace. All that was left of their vast European empire was a small pocket of land around Istanbul itself. It was a massive psychological blow. The empire had lost its heartland, the very region that had been the foundation of its power for over 5 centuries. But the humiliation wasn't over. A few months later, the Second Balkan War broke out. This time, the Balkan states were fighting among themselves over the spoils of the First War. The Ottomans, seeing an opportunity to reclaim some of their lost land, joined the fray. They were able to retake the city of Edirne, the old Ottoman capital in Europe, a small victory that did little to make up for the catastrophic losses of the First War. But it was a small moment of pride in a period of otherwise complete humiliation. The Balkan Wars had a profound and lasting effect on the Ottoman Empire. They exposed the deep corruption and incompetence of the Ottoman military and the political establishment. The Young Turks, who had promised to restore the empire's power, had presided over a series of humiliating defeats. Their reputation was in tatters, and their hold on power was now deeply precarious. The wars also had a devastating effect on the empire's finances. The cost of the wars and the loss of the tax-paying population in the Balkans pushed the empire further into debt and made it even more reliant on European powers. The wars also had a tragic human cost. Hundreds of thousands of Ottoman Muslims were driven from their homes in the Balkans, becoming refugees in their own empire. They were a bitter and resentful population, and their presence would only serve to increase the already tense ethnic and religious tensions in the empire. The Balkan Wars were the last great act of the Ottoman Empire as a European power. The empire was now reduced to a rump state, a kind of sick old man in a small part of Anatolia, with a small piece of territory in Europe. It was a shadow of its former glory, a state that was no longer a major player on the world stage. It had been defeated, humiliated, and stripped of its most important territories. But the story of the Ottoman Empire was not yet over. The Young Turks, in a final act of desperation, would make one more monumental gamble. A gamble that would bring about the complete and final collapse of the empire. They would, in a truly stunning act of folly, enter the First World War. The Balkan Wars had left the Ottoman Empire broken, humiliated, and stripped of its most valuable territories. The Young Turks, now led by a triumvirate of ambitious and ruthless military officers, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, were in a state of profound political crisis. They had promised to save the empire, and they had presided over its biggest defeat in centuries. But instead of admitting their failures, they doubled down on their disastrous policies. They were deeply nationalistic and deeply paranoid, and they saw a new opportunity in the growing tensions between the great powers of Europe. They believed that by allying themselves with a major European power, they could reclaim their lost territories and restore the empire's prestige. And in a final, monumental act of folly, they chose to ally themselves with Germany, a decision that would prove to be the final nail in the empire's coffin. The Ottoman Empire's entry into World War I was a truly high-stakes gamble. The German leadership, who had been cultivating a relationship with the Young Turks for years, saw the Ottomans not as an equal partner, but as a useful pawn. They wanted the Ottomans to open up new fronts against the Entente powers, particularly Russia and Great Britain, and to threaten their vast colonial empires in the Middle East. The Ottomans, for their part, were a divided nation. The Sultan and many of the old guard were against the war, but the Young Turks, led by the fanatically pro-German Enver Pasha, were able to push the empire into the conflict. They signed a secret treaty of alliance with Germany in 1914, and in a move that sealed their fate, they launched a surprise naval attack on Russian ports in the Black Sea. The empire was officially at war, and the sick man of Europe was now in a fight for its very survival. The war was a complete and utter catastrophe for the Ottoman Empire. It was forced to fight on multiple fronts: in the Caucasus against the Russians, in Mesopotamia against the British, and in the Levant and the Sinai against the British. The empire, which was already on the verge of financial collapse, was completely unprepared for a modern total war. Its army was poorly equipped and poorly led, and its infrastructure was a shambles. The British, with their superior technology and their vast resources, were able to outmaneuver the Ottoman forces in the Middle East. The most famous campaign of the war was the Gallipoli campaign, a massive Allied amphibious assault on the Dardanelles, which was meant to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and to open up a supply route to Russia. It was a long, brutal, and bloody affair, a kind of modern trench warfare that was unprecedented in its scale and horror. The Ottomans, fighting on their own soil, were able to hold off the Allied forces, and the campaign was a complete and humiliating failure for the British and the French. It was a moment of immense national pride for the Turks, and it gave a young Ottoman officer named Mustafa Kemal, who would later become the father of modern Turkey, his first taste of military glory. But the victory at Gallipoli was an exception in a war that was otherwise a series of long, painful defeats. The British, with the help of Arab forces, slowly pushed the Ottoman army out of Mesopotamia and the Levant. The Arab Revolt, a British-sponsored uprising of Arab tribesmen against the Ottoman rule, was a huge blow to the empire, and it showed that the empire's non-Turkish subjects had no loyalty to Istanbul. The Ottoman army was also fighting a brutal and protracted war against the Russians in the Caucasus, a war that would have terrible consequences. The Ottoman leadership, fearing that the Armenians who lived in the region were disloyal and would side with the Russians, launched a campaign of forced deportations and massacres. The events of this period are a source of immense controversy and pain, and they remain a dark and tragic chapter of Ottoman history. The empire was fighting for its life, but in its desperation, it was also committing a series of unspeakable atrocities. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of collapse. Its army was in tatters, Its economy was in ruins, and its people were starving. The war, which had been meant to save the empire, had instead destroyed it. The Ottoman Empire, after 4 years of relentless, brutal, and utterly ruinous war, was on its knees. Its army was defeated, its economy was in ruins, and its people were starving. The final nail in the coffin was the signing of the Armistice of Mudros in October 1918. It was a humiliating surrender, a document that gave the victorious Allies the right to occupy Ottoman territory, to control its railway network and its strategic points, and to effectively dismantle the empire. The Sultan, Mehmed VI, was now a powerless figurehead, a kind of ceremonial prisoner in his own palace. Istanbul was occupied by Allied troops, a final, crushing humiliation for a city that had been the seat of an empire for nearly 5 centuries. The Ottoman Empire, which had been a great world power for so long, was now reduced to a pathetic shell of its former self, a country that had been completely defeated and was now waiting for its final, definitive end. The end, when it came, was not quick or peaceful. The Allies, in their arrogance and their colonial ambitions, began to carve up the empire's remaining territory. The British and the French took control of the Middle East, a move that would have profound and lasting consequences for the region. The Greeks, with the encouragement of the Western powers, invaded Anatolia, the very heartland of the Turkish people. Their goal was to create a new Hellenic empire, a kind of neo-Byzantine state. It looked like the end had finally come. The old great Ottoman Empire was finished, and in its place, a new, much smaller Turkish state would be born. But the Turkish people, who had been defeated and humiliated so many times, were not yet ready to give up. They had one more fight left in them, and that fight would be led by a brilliant and charismatic military commander who had risen to fame at the Gallipoli campaign, Mustafa Kemal. Mustafa Kemal was a different kind of Ottoman leader. He was a product of the Tanzimat reforms, a modern, secular, and deeply nationalistic man who had little respect for the old sultanate and the old traditions. He believed that the only way to save the Turkish people was to create a new, modern, and secular nation-state, a Republic of Turkey, that would be completely separate from the Ottoman past. He went to Anatolia and began to organize a new army, a kind of popular resistance force that would fight against the Allied occupation and the Greek invasion. He was a brilliant strategist and a masterful politician, and he was able to unite the various Turkish factions behind his leadership. He held a series of national congresses and created a new provisional government in Ankara, a symbolic defiance of the Sultan in Istanbul. The stage was set for the final, bloody showdown, a war that would be fought not to save an empire, but to create a nation. The Turkish War of Independence was a fierce, 2-year-long conflict that would decide the fate of the Turkish people. Mustafa Kemal's forces, which were outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a grim determination. They fought against the Greeks in the west, and they fought against the French and the British in the south and the east. The Turkish forces, with their superior leadership and their fierce determination, were able to push the Greek army out of Anatolia in a series of shocking and decisive victories. The war ended in 1922 with the complete and total defeat of the Greek army. The Allies, who had been so confident in their ability to carve up the empire, were now forced to deal with a new reality. A new Turkish nation was being born, and it was a nation that was not going to be a puppet of the Western powers. With the Greeks defeated and the Allies in retreat, Mustafa Kemal turned his attention to the last vestige of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultanate itself. In a single, decisive vote in 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman Sultan, was forced to flee the country in shame on a British warship. The Ottoman Empire was officially dead, and in its place, a new republic was born. It was a tragic and beautiful end to a long and complex history. The empire had lasted for over 6 centuries, but in the end, it was a victim of its own inability to change and adapt. Its long, slow, and agonizing decline had finally come to an end. And from the ashes of a great empire, a new nation had been born. The Sultanate was no more. The Ottoman Empire had been officially dissolved, and Mustafa Kemal, now known as Ataturk, or Father of the Turks, had a new and even more monumental task before him: to build a new nation from the ashes of the old. This was not going to be an easy task. The country was in ruins, its economy was in tatters, and its people were exhausted from decades of war. But Ataturk was not a man to be deterred by a challenge. He was a visionary and a true revolutionary, and he set about creating a modern, secular, and democratic republic that would be completely divorced from the Ottoman past. His reforms were sweeping and radical, a kind of cultural shock therapy that was meant to bring a deeply traditional society into the 20th century. His first order of business was to abolish the caliphate in 1924, a move that officially separated religion and state and sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. The Sultanate was gone, and now the spiritual head of Sunni Islam, a title held by the Ottoman sultans for centuries, was also gone. It was a clear and definitive signal that the new Turkey was going to be a secular state. He then set about reforming every aspect of Turkish society. He abolished the fez, a traditional hat that was seen as a symbol of the old Ottoman order, and he encouraged people to wear Western-style clothing. He adopted the Latin alphabet, a huge and revolutionary change that made literacy more widespread and helped to break the cultural ties to the old Ottoman past. He gave women the right to vote and hold political office, a move that was decades ahead of many European countries. He reformed the legal system, replacing the old religious laws with a new secular code that was based on the Swiss Civil Code. He was, in every sense of the word, a modernizer. These reforms were not just about changing laws, they were about creating a new national identity. Ataturk believed that the old Ottoman identity, with its focus on religion and ethnicity, was a liability. He wanted to create a new Turkish identity that was based on a shared language, a shared history, and a shared commitment to the new republic. He promoted a kind of Turkish nationalism that was a deliberate departure from the pan-Turkic and pan-Islamic ideologies of the Young Turks. He wanted the new Turkey to be a modern, Western-style nation, a proud member of the family of nations. But the new republic, for all its idealism, was not a perfect democracy. Ataturk was a brilliant but autocratic leader, and he ruled with an iron fist. He was a man who believed that the Turkish people needed to be led. and he would not tolerate any opposition to his reforms. He suppressed political dissent, and he used his immense personal power to push through his revolutionary changes. He was a liberator, but he was also a dictator, a man who, in his own way, was just as much of a paradox as the sultans he had overthrown. He had saved the Turkish people, but he had done so by creating a one-party state that would last for decades. And so, the story of the Ottoman Empire comes to an end. It was a story that lasted for over 6 centuries, a story of incredible highs and tragic lows, a story of a nomadic tribe that grew to become a great empire, a story of conquest and defeat, of glory and humiliation. The empire had been a testament to the power of organization and the resilience of a people, a state that had survived for so long against all odds. But in the end, it was a victim of its own inability to change and adapt. It was a great, ancient ship that was slowly taking on water, and every time someone tried to patch the hole, someone else would come along and rip the patch off. The empire was a complex and often contradictory place, a place of immense cruelty and immense beauty, a place of great saints and great sinners, a place that was both a bridge between East and West and a great wall that separated them. The great cities are still there, the palaces, the mosques, the fountains. They stand as quiet witnesses to a history that is now just a distant memory. They tell a story of a people who once ruled a vast empire, a people who, in their own way, were a part of something truly magnificent. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not just a story of a political entity. It is the story of a civilization that rose and fell, a civilization that left a lasting and indelible mark on the world. Its story is a long, complex, and beautiful one, full of heroes and villains, of triumph and tragedy. Now, as the last words of this long story fade into the stillness of the night, you can close your eyes. Let the images of the past, the galloping cavalry, the bustling bazaars, the quiet mosques, recede into the soft mist of sleep. The empire has found its rest. And now, my friend, it is time for you to find yours.